Tula, Arsenal, Russian Empire, 1891. A rifle rolls off a production line that will not stop running in one form or another for the next 130 years. Nobody in that factory has any idea what they've just started. This single design will be carried into more wars on more continents by more armies than any other rifle ever built. It will outlive the empire that created it. It will outlive the country that replaced that empire. It will outlive the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the collapse of half the governments that ever issued it. And somewhere in the world today, in the hands of someone who was not born when the Soviet Union still existed, one of these rifles is still being fired. This is the Mosin-Nagant, the rifle that refuses to stop. To understand why this design has lasted longer than any other military rifle in history, you have to go back to a war Russia was losing for a very specific and humiliating reason. In the 1870s, during the Russo-Turkish War, Russian infantry carried single-shot rifles, reliable, accurate at range, and catastrophically slow to reload compared to the weapon Turkish soldiers were carrying against them. Winchester lever-action repeaters, capable of firing multiple rounds before a Russian soldier could chamber a second shot. Russian troops were being outgunned not because they lacked courage, but because their rate of fire simply couldn't compete. The Imperial Russian Army walked away from that war with an uncomfortable lesson. Whatever came next had to fire faster, and it had to do it reliably in the hands of ordinary conscripts, not just trained marksmen. In 1888, the Tsarist government appointed a commission to solve this problem properly. Two competing designs emerged from the process. One came from Sergei Ivanovich Mosin, a Russian army officer working at the Tula arsenal, who had designed a strong, simple bolt-action receiver. The other came from Mosin-Nagant, a Belgian weapons designer whose magazine and cartridge feeding system was considered more efficient and more reliable than Mosin's own feeding mechanism. The commission did something unusual. Rather than choosing one designer's complete rifle over the others, they combined them. Mosin's receiver and bolt, Nagant's magazine. The result, adopted in 1891, would eventually become known in the West by both their names, even though the Russian military itself never officially called it that. Inside Russia, it was simply the Vintovka Mosina, the Mosin rifle. If you're finding this interesting, subscribing helps make sure you don't miss what happens next. What made this rifle succeed wasn't elegance. It was the opposite. Every design decision inside the Mosin-Nagant prioritized reliability over refinement. A 5-round internal magazine loaded by simple stripper clips. A bolt mechanism using 2 large locking lugs at the front, strong enough to handle a powerful cartridge without needing precision tolerances that would be difficult to manufacture at scale or maintain in field conditions. A design that could be built by relatively unskilled factory labor, function after being dropped in mud, sand or snow, and still fire when a soldier with almost no formal training pulled the trigger. This was not a rifle built to be the best rifle in the world. It was built to be a rifle that millions of ordinary conscripts, many of them barely literate, many of them handed a weapon for the first time days before combat, could use without it failing them. That single design philosophy is the reason this rifle would still be relevant more than a century later, long after every other rifle from its era had been retired to museum shelves. Production began simultaneously at 3 arsenals, Tula, Izhevsk and Sestroretsk. By the time of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, roughly 3.8 million of these rifles were already in Russian service. And the rifle's very first combat use, oddly enough, wasn't even against a European enemy. In 1899, Russian troops carried it during the international intervention against the Boxer Rebellion in China, making its combat debut against Chinese forces years before it would define an entire century of Russian warfare. The Chinese soldiers who encountered it gave it a name of their own, one that had nothing to do with either Mosin or Nagant. They called it the water-linked pearl rifle, a description inspired by the smooth, distinctive sound of its action cycling, round after round, like droplets falling in sequence. That was 1899. The rifle had barely left the factory. It had already crossed a continent and earned a nickname in a language its designers never spoke. What followed over the next 50 years reads less like the service record of a single weapon and more like a tour of nearly every major conflict of the 20th century. It was the standard Russian infantry rifle of the First World War, carried by millions of soldiers across the Eastern Front. When the Russian Revolution tore the country apart, it armed both sides of the Russian Civil War simultaneously, Red Army and White Army soldiers firing the exact same rifle at each other. It fought through the Polish-Soviet War. It armed both sides again during the Finnish Civil War. It went through the brutal cold of the Winter War against Finland, where its 5-round magazine and rock-solid reliability in sub-zero conditions proved decisive when more sophisticated rifles on both sides struggled with frozen lubricant and jammed actions. Then came the Second World War, and the Mosin-Nagant became, by sheer volume, one of the defining weapons of the entire Eastern Front. It was the rifle in the hands of the defenders during the siege of Stalingrad. Its sniper variant, fitted with a simple telescopic sight, became one of the most feared weapons of urban combat in that battle specifically, associated with some of the deadliest confirmed kill counts of any sniper rifle in the war. By the end of the Second World War, an estimated 37 million of these rifles had been manufactured. 37 million, not a typo. That number alone makes it one of the most mass-produced firearms in human history, a figure that puts it in the same conversation as the AK-47 itself, the rifle that would eventually replace it in frontline Soviet service. And here is where most people assume the story ends. The Soviet Union officially stopped producing new Mosin-Nagants after 1948. Surely, you'd think, a rifle designed in 1891, superseded by more modern Soviet weapons, would fade into retirement soon after. It did not fade, it spread. Rather than scrapping millions of surplus rifles, the Soviet Union did something that would define the weapon's second act entirely. It gave them away. To allied and client states across the developing world as war aid, as symbols of solidarity, as cheap and reliable infantry weapons for movements the Soviet Union wanted armed but didn't necessarily want to arm with its newest technology. The manufacturing tooling itself was sold or transferred to other countries entirely. Poland, Hungary, China and others began producing their own versions. The rifle that started in a single Russian arsenal in 1891 was now being built on at least 4 continents under different flags for different armies, decades after its original design was supposedly obsolete. It turned up in North Korean and Chinese hands as the standard infantry rifle facing American and UN forces throughout the Korean War. It turned up in Vietnam. Carried by the Viet Minh and later the Viet Cong, sniper variants specifically prized for their accuracy in the dense jungle terrain, where a single well-placed shot mattered more than volume of fire. American and Hungarian museum records today include Mosin-Nagant sniper rifles captured directly from North Vietnamese snipers in combat, decades after the weapon was supposedly retired by its original manufacturer. It armed forces in the Chinese Civil War. It appeared in the Spanish Civil War on both sides. It equipped Cuban revolutionary forces. It was distributed to Egypt, Syria and Iraq during various Cold War-era conflicts across the Middle East. It surfaced again during the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s, and it was still being documented in the hands of irregular forces in Afghanistan as late as the 1990s, nearly a full century, after Sergei Mosin first submitted his receiver design to a Tsarist commission. Here's the number that should genuinely stop you. A rifle finalized in 1891 was still being actively fired in armed conflicts 100 years later in the 1890s. Not in a museum, not in a collector's cabinet. In actual combat by actual soldiers on the other side of the planet from the factory that built it. Most weapons don't survive one major war before being outclassed and discarded. This one has now outlasted an unbroken chain of conflicts spanning the fall of the Russian Empire, 2 world wars, the entire Cold War, and the collapse of the very superpower that once mass-produced it by the millions. Part of the reason lies in simple economics. Decades of Cold War surplus meant these rifles were, for most of the 20th century, some of the cheapest military-grade firearms available anywhere on Earth. Cheap enough for insurgent movements with no state backing, cheap enough for irregular militias, cheap enough that even today they remain widely available on civilian markets in the West. Prized now not for combat effectiveness, but for their remarkable, stubborn functionality after more than a century. Because that's the part that separates this weapon from every other rifle of its era. It isn't just old, it works. Take a Mosin-Nagant manufactured in 1943, feed it ammunition, manufactured in the same cartridge specification the Tsarist Commission approved in 1891, and it will fire exactly the way it was designed to. The same bolt, the same magazine, the same 5 rounds. Unchanged, because it never needed to change. Modern militaries around the world have spent the decades since the Second World War developing rifles with more firepower, more accuracy, more sophistication in every conceivable dimension. And in scattered corners of the globe, in the hands of forces without access to that modern hardware, or who simply have millions of these rifles sitting in old armories doing nothing else. The same basic design that Sergei Mosin and Mosin-Nagant argued over in a Tsarist commission room in 1891 continues to see genuine documented use in armed conflicts to this day. No other military rifle in history has a service record that even approaches this. Not the Lee Enfield, not the Springfield, not the Mauser Karabiner. Every one of those weapons had its era, was retired, and moved into history books and museum displays. The Mosin-Nagant never fully left the field. 37 million rifles built across 4 continents, under a dozen different flags, over more than half a century of continuous production, followed by another 7 decades of continued combat use on Cold War surplus stock alone. A rifle designed to solve one specific, humiliating problem for a 19th century Russian army losing a war to faster firing Turkish repeaters has now outlasted every government that ever manufactured it, every alliance that ever distributed it, and every rifle that was ever supposed to replace it. 130 years later, in armories, in conflict zones, in the hands of people who have no idea their weapon shares its exact mechanical DNA, with a rifle carried by soldiers fighting the Boxer Rebellion, the water-linked Pearl rifle is still cycling exactly the way it did the day it left the Tula arsenal. Still working, still reliable, still, somewhere in the world right now, loaded